Paul stretched his arms and smiled. College was over. No more exams, no more long nights studying. Now, he needed a job. He dreamed of becoming a writer, working for a newspaper. But first, he wanted to rest. The house was warm and the air felt heavy. I need some fresh air, Paul thought. He stepped outside and walked toward the river. The small town was quiet, with only a few people in the streets. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. As he reached the riverbank, Paul saw a girl standing alone. She had long dark hair and wore a simple white dress. The water reflected her image like a painting. She looked peaceful. Paul hesitated, then took a step forward. "Hello," he said, his voice gentle. The girl turned and smiled. "Hello," she replied. "What's your name?" Paul asked. "I'm Maria," she said. They started talking. At first, about simple things, the weather, the river, the birds flying above them. But soon, the conversation flowed. Maria spoke about her life, her family, her love for books. Paul felt comfortable, as if he had known her forever. The sun disappeared, and the sky darkened. Maria looked at the time. "I have to go," she said. "Where do you live?" Paul asked. She pointed to the large white house on the hill. Paul felt a small ache in his chest. That house was famous, only the wealthiest people in town lived there. "And you?" Maria asked. Paul smiled. "The little brown house near the market." They laughed, but Paul felt something inside him shift. He knew it already, he was falling in love. Paul and Maria met by the river every evening. She always wore elegant dresses, her hair shining in the sunset light. Paul loved the way she smiled, the way she listened to his stories. But sometimes, Maria looked sad. Paul noticed, but he didn't ask. He was too afraid of the answer. One evening, Paul held her hand. "Maria," he said, his voice steady, "I wrote something for you." He pulled a small paper from his pocket and unfolded it. Clearing his throat, he read, "I met her in the evening by the riverside. Her dress was creamy white, and her hair was tied. She turned and smiled at me, and I asked her for her name. Though I am young and poor, my love will stay the same." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful, Paul." Paul took a deep breath. He had to say it. "Maria, I love you." She smiled, but there was something behind her eyes, something uncertain. "Do you love me?" he asked. "Yes, Paul," she whispered. His heart raced. He had dreamed of this moment. "Then marry me," Paul said, gripping her hands. "I am poor now, but one day I will be a great writer. We will be happy together." Maria's smile faded. She stood up, stepping back. "Paul, say yes," he pleaded. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Then suddenly she turned and ran. "Maria," Paul called, his voice desperate. But she didn't stop. Paul stood there, confused and heartbroken. Why did she run? She said she loved him. So why was she leaving? Paul spent the next day lost in thought. Maria loved him, he was sure of it. But why did she run? Was she afraid? Confused? That evening, as he sat with his mother, a knock came at the door. Paul opened it and saw a man in a servant's uniform. "I am from the house on the hill," the man said. "My mistress wishes to see you." Paul's heart pounded. Maria? Did she change her mind? "Yes, I'll come," he said quickly. His mother stood at the door, watching. She sighed. "The house on the hill. I know those people," she murmured. "My poor son." Paul followed the servant up the wide steps into the grand house. The inside was even more magnificent, gold-framed paintings, thick carpets, and shining chandeliers. He caught sight of himself in a mirror. His clothes were simple. His shoes were worn, He suddenly felt out of place. The servant led him into a large room. A woman sat in an elegant chair. Her eyes were cold, her lips thin, her hands covered in heavy rings. Maria stood behind her, silent. "So, you wish to marry my daughter," the old woman said. Her voice was sharp, full of authority. Paul lifted his chin. "Yes, I love her." The woman laughed, a cruel sound. "You? A poor student? No money, no status, no future." She shook her head. "Maria will marry someone else. A man of wealth and power." Paul turned to Maria. "Tell her she's wrong." Maria avoided his eyes. The old woman stood. "You will never see her again." Paul's chest tightened. "Maria?" Finally, she looked at him. But she said nothing. Paul walked home in silence. His heart felt heavy, his hands clenched into fists. Maria loved him, he knew it. So why had she stayed silent? His mother saw his face when he entered. She didn't ask. She simply pulled him into a hug. "They are bad people, my son," she whispered. "Forget her." But how could he? Maria wasn't like her mother. She was kind, gentle. She had cried for him. But in the end, she chose wealth over love. Days passed, Paul barely spoke. He didn't eat much. He spent hours by the river, staring at the water, remembering the way Maria had smiled at him. One morning, as he sat at the kitchen table, his mother placed a newspaper in front of him. "Read this," she said. Paul glanced at it without interest until he saw a headline. "Rich man's beautiful bride." His breath caught. There was a photo of Maria, dressed in a long white gown, a diamond necklace around her neck. Beside her stood her husband, an older man, round and bald, grinning like he had won a prize. Paul turned the paper over, his stomach twisting. On the back page, something caught his eye. Short story contest. Win $500. His fingers tightened around the newspaper. A story contest. A chance. His mind raced. He would write his story, the story of Paul and Maria. He would pour his pain onto the page. And he would win. She will read it, he thought. And she will regret everything. For the first time in weeks, Paul felt something new. Not sadness. Not heartbreak, determination. Paul woke up early the next morning, his mind clear for the first time in weeks. He sat at his small wooden desk, pen in hand, and began to write. The words flowed from him, filled with emotion. He wrote about love and loss, about dreams and betrayal. Page after page, he poured his heart into the story. His mother watched from the doorway, smiling softly. Paul was finally alive again. Some days, writing felt easy. Other days, his hands trembled as he remembered Maria's face. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. After days of hard work, the story was finished. Paul read it aloud to his mother. She wiped a tear from her cheek and nodded. "It's perfect." With a deep breath, Paul copied it neatly onto a fresh sheet of paper and sent it to the newspaper. Then he waited. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Paul stared at it, afraid to open it. His mother took it from his hands, opened it, and began to read. She gasped. "Paul, read this." Paul took the letter, his hands shaking. "Dear sir, we are pleased to inform you that you have won first prize in our story competition. Please visit our office to collect your prize." His heart raced. He had won. Paul grabbed his mother's hands and danced around the small kitchen. "I did it. I really did it." Then he stopped. "Will Maria read my story?" His mother's smile faded. "Do you still love her, Paul?" Paul hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "I just want her to know what she lost." Paul arrived at the newspaper office early. The manager greeted him with a firm handshake and a wide smile. "Your story is excellent," the man said. "Very emotional. Readers loved it." Paul accepted the prize money with gratitude, but the manager wasn't finished. "You have talent, Paul," he continued. "We need writers like you. How would you like to work for us?" Paul's breath caught. A real job as a writer. His dream. "Yes," he said without hesitation. That night, Paul sat at his small table, staring at the prize money. He could buy new clothes, help his mother, maybe even move to a better home. He had a future now. But just as he was feeling proud, Maria returned. He was leaving the newspaper office one afternoon when he saw her standing by the entrance. She wore a black dress, her face pale and serious. "Maria?" Paul stopped in his tracks. She gave him a sad smile. "My mother died," she said quietly. "And I left my husband." Paul felt his stomach tighten. "Why?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I was never happy. I thought money would bring me freedom, but it didn't." She stepped closer. "Paul, I read your story." He stiffened. "Did you?" She nodded. "I loved it. It made me realize something. I made a mistake." She reached for his hand. "I still love you." Paul looked at her, his heart pounding. This was what he had dreamed of, wasn't it? But something felt different. Maria had returned. But was it too late? Paul stood still, staring at Maria. A few months ago, he would have given anything to hear those words. But now they felt empty. "You still love me?" he asked, his voice calm. "Yes, Paul," Maria said, stepping closer. "I was wrong. I thought I needed wealth to be happy. But I was miserable." Paul's jaw tightened. "But now that your mother is gone and your marriage is over, you come back to me." Maria swallowed hard. "I left everything behind, Paul. The money, the house, none of it mattered. I realized I only wanted you." Paul studied her face. She was still beautiful, but something had changed. Or maybe it was him who had changed. "I loved you once, Maria," he said softly. "But love isn't just words. It's choices. And you chose a different life." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "But Paul shook his head. "I can't go back." She lowered her gaze. "I understand." Maria turned and walked away. Paul watched her go, feeling a strange sense of relief. He thought he would feel pain, but instead he felt free. That evening, Paul returned home. His mother was in the kitchen, talking to a young woman. She turned and smiled. "Paul, this is Elsa, your cousin. She just arrived in town." Elsa had kind eyes and a warm smile. She extended her hand. "Nice to meet you." Paul smiled back. "Nice to meet you too." As they sat down to dinner, laughter filled the small house. Paul no longer thought of Maria. He had a new job, a bright future, and a heart finally at peace. The past was behind him. The best part of his life was just beginning. Tell us in the comments what you learned today. Your feedback is super important for us to keep bringing even better content. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to keep practicing English in a natural and engaging way. See you in the next video.